Welcome to the Love Your Story podcast. Do you suffer from depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder, even psychosis? Well, my guest today, Bronwyn Schweigerdt, may be the most evocative psychotherapist that you've ever heard, because instead of fixing people's messes, her goal is to elicit the feelings that we're most ashamed to have, such as hatred or betrayal, anger, shame, these ones that we try to press down. And she knows that even though these feelings are invisible, that they don't evaporate. Instead, they store away in our bodies when we disown them. So these hidden feelings haunt us. They come back to us in mental illness until we externalize them into words, until we tell our stories. So stay tuned and let's have some words with Bronwyn. Stories are our lives in language. Welcome to the Love Your Story podcast. I'm Lori Lee, and I'm excited for our future together of telling stories, evaluating our own stories, and lifting ourselves and others to greater places because of our control over our stories. This podcast is about empowerment and giving you, the listener, ideas to work with in making your stories work for you. Story power serves you best when you know how to use it. Bronwyn has a master's degree in counseling and another in nutrition. She is a public speaker and an author and a licensed psychotherapist. I'm excited to have her on the show, as depression and anxiety have shown up in my own kids' lives as adults. And so I'm always looking for answers. So let's get right down to talking about this topic of how feelings buried alive cause us or can cause us serious harm. Bronwyn, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you, Lori Lee.
So I want to start with your story. This is where we always start on the show. What in your life brought you to want to specialize in this career and in this topic?
Yeah, I would love to share my story. It's quite a humbling one. So I was perfectly fine with my first career, which was nutrition. I already had my master's degree, like you know, and yet, life kind of changed things around. And I myself fell into a very, very severe depressive episode. And I went looking for a good therapist and tried multiple therapists. And I remember back in the day when you would sit in the office of a therapist, I remember sitting there thinking to myself, Bronwyn, you're barely functioning right now, but I still think you'd make a better therapist to you than this person. And I never found that good enough therapist. And so part of my healing journey for that depressive episode was going back to school and getting another master's degree in counseling psychology and becoming that therapist to me and to others that I needed so desperately.
That's a bold move. And isn't it interesting how in life, so oftentimes we find that there's a hole in something that we need. And so it moves us into filling it. That's a great reason. What was it, if I can ask, that put you into that depressive episode? Were you able to work and sort through that?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I have no secrets. So that first depressive episode, I had a subsequent one a few years later that was even more severe in a way. I have spent a lot of time in retrospect kind of unpacking that for both of those. I think the commonality for both was suppressed anger, which is why I'm now an anger expert, because I view all mental illness as a symptom of suppressed anger, specifically like feelings of rejection or betrayal or abandonment. Those are all overlapping feelings and they make us the most angry. And yet we don't feel entitled to feel angry a lot of the time, or we are so dissociative, we don't even know how angry we are. And so we dissociate from our anger, we suppress it, and then we get sick. And that was my case. My anger in that first episode was at my husband. My betrayal feelings were at him because we had just uprooted and moved and I didn't know a single soul. I didn't have a job there. My daughter was just starting kindergarten. I was alone all day, every day, and I was so lonely. And I looked at him one night and I just I would imagine this is, 15, 16 years ago now, but I imagine I had tears in my eyes. And I just looked at him like, I'm so lonely. And I just remember the look on his face was so hardened. The look in his eyes was very hardened. He was withholding empathy from me in that moment. And that was very much echoing my experience of my mother throughout my whole life. So little Bronwyn, I'm big into inner child work. Little Bronwyn was very triggered right then because there's no empathy and she's in so much pain. So that sent me into a spiral of depression. But I wasn't aware of that happening really. And I've talked about it with my husband, and I realize now, and this also applies to probably all of our listeners, is he felt responsible for my sadness and my pain because he's the one who lost the job and we had to relocate for his new job. And so when we feel responsible for someone else's feelings, like he did in that moment, we can't empathize because he was too busy, like trying to not feel like he was failing me, which is exactly how he felt. So if he empathized with me, it was like, okay, now I failed her. I'm shameful. And so his withholding empathy, it felt like my mother, but it wasn't with the same, rationale. It was more like, I'm a failure and I don't want to feel more like a failure if I validate her feelings, So now I understand all that. But for me, I was just so betrayed by him in that moment. And I felt even more alone. I felt even more lonely than I did before that, And so that
And
was that depressive
sometimes
episode.
those are the hardest lonelies when you're with somebody, but you're still lonely because that connection has been severed somehow, even if it's through something like you're
Yeah.
talking about here that is just a miscommunication and defenses and that kind of thing. So easy for that disconnect to bring on a deep loneliness. So,
Yeah.
how did you work through that?
Well, I went back to grad school and that gave me a feeling of belonging.
Sure.
And then, starting a new career. But I actually fell into a subsequent depression. And that was when I started out as an intern. I had a supervisor and his name was Dave. And he was just not a malicious person, but I would say he's probably just a very clueless person. And it's very frightening to me that he's a licensed therapist, actually. But
Mm.
again, this kind of reinforced my experience of so many other therapists, unfortunately. And even though he wasn't technically that much older than me, I was projecting all my daddy issues onto him. So I wanted to win Dave's approval. Little Bronwyn was like, I'm going to win approval from Dave, who's my daddy figure right here. And so he wanted my first client ever to be a couple. And if you know anything about doing couples therapy, like it is so much more difficult. Like you need special training. It is not a good idea to give someone just starting out as an intern a couple. It's overwhelming and it can cause burnout. So that's what he said. And instead of me being responsible with my feeling of betrayal in that moment and saying, you know what, Dave, I'm not going to do that. And if you insist, I guess I'm going to find a different place to work because this is not a good fit. That's what I should have done with my feelings of anger. But what I didn't do was feel responsible for my anger because I was too busy trying to win his approval. So I said, I don't feel ready to do that. And he said, well, you're going to do it. And I said, okay. And so I betrayed myself and I suppressed that anger at him, but I also suppressed that, I wasn't responsible for me. I betrayed myself. And that sent me into a very severe depressive episode where I felt very shameful, actually.
How long did it take you to come out of that one?
Oh man, that one is like a domino game of dominoes because one shameful thing led to another. So I talk a lot about this on my podcast. When we are disassociated, shame causes us to disassociate, meaning we don't feel our feelings. And when we disassociate, like I did, because I felt so ashamed, we do stupid things. It's like someone takes over our body and we're like, oh my God, I did that. And so then we act out shamefully. So I got angry and I was passive aggressive in some other ways. I got held accountable. That made me more ashamed. I felt like I was 10 years old. And all that shame kind of just sent me into a very severe depression episode. So that one lasted probably 5 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
See, one of the things that I think is so complex is, like I mentioned, my kids are dealing with some of that, and they, will try to explain their feelings or their thoughts, or they won't. My youngest just doesn't want to talk about anything, and I, as their mom, I'm always trying to solve the problem, and so I'll say things, and I'm fluent in story work, so about not playing the victim and finding the
Mm,
meaning in the things that have happened to you, and all of these things that I feel are being helpful. But then I'll read other things about, I was reading a book after that about the growth mindset versus the set
mm,
mindset. And they
mm,
were giving examples of how parents will really encourage their child by saying, "Oh, you're a natural at this. That's great." And the parent thinks that they are
mm,
reinforcing the positivity around what the child's trying to do, but what they're really doing is not enforcing a growth mindset about how if you work at something, you can get better at it. Instead, they're saying you're naturally good at this. And if you don't do if you don't do a good job at something naturally, that you can't build on it. Does that make sense? Anyway, when I was reading these comparisons, I was thinking, "Oh my gosh, how many times might I have said something with the best intent that was really reinforcing something that wasn't helpful and might have been setting up a wrong mindset?" And so long story short, I'm coming back around to this, which is when my kids are trying to share what they're going through, how many times might I, in my,
mm,
attempts to help them not get
mm.
lost in shame or bitterness or victimhood, saying things with the best intent that to me make perfect sense, but might they be interpreting them, or, the child in them be interpreting it in a way that
Mm.
maybe is reinforcing shame or something, and you don't know it. Communication between people is so hard.
It is hard. So I'm going to say two things. So first, Lori Lee, all parents screw up their kids. We all do. And I've talked at length on my podcast again, like about my own relationship with my daughter. The good news is, even though she saw me as the enemy so that first depressive episode I was in, she was 5 and she felt very rejected by me, which, if you have a parent who's depressed, you feel like completely emotionally abandoned and rejected by that parent. And that creates shame. It's because children go, "Oh, I must be the problem. That's why I'm rejected. It's me." And so just like maybe a year and a half ago, I was able, and she kind of acted like she hated me since that happened when she was 5. And did that add to my depression? Yes, it did. Because now my beloved daughter is acting like I'm her enemy, and she's only 5. She's not even 13 yet. And it was horrible, actually. So just like a year and a half ago, I said to her, "I want little Edie to know, little 5-year-old Edie to know that when she felt rejected by mom, that was 100% a mom problem and 0% an Edie problem." And that did something in her. I think what it did is it dissipated that shame that she felt. And she has become like a different person. She had anxiety from age 5 until that happened. She also had headaches, chronic headaches, and chronic stomach aches for those 14 years, like almost daily, with
Wow.
anxiety. And all those things are no more. She
Wow.
doesn't have shame anymore. And I've seen her just finally really blossom into herself and have this confidence in herself, humility still, but confidence. And so that's what shame does. And so I just want to give hope to anyone listening. We all screw up our kids. We all do. And it's not about being a perfect parent. It's about repairing the rupture that we make. And studies show in attachment theory that a relationship that has a rupture, all relationships have ruptures, first of all. It's not realistic to think that there's one that doesn't. But if there is a good repair after that rupture, where the offending party, who is always the adult, the parent, says, "You know what, honey, I need you to know, this is what really happened. I am so sorry." And really helps that child see that they were not the shameful one. That rejection was a mom problem, not a daughter problem. So when there's that repair, those relationships, and the studies show this, are so much stronger than if there had been a relationship with no rupture at all. Because now both parties trust this is a relationship where I can be myself. It's not going to end the relationship. I can make mistakes and I can still trust this relationship to last. I can be vulnerable in this relationship. It just, and kids need that. And kids need to know, like, oh, making mistakes is human. That's what humans do. We make mistakes. It's not shameful. It's human. And my mom has been that model for me because she's apologized to me for her mistakes. And so it just creates this great environment for growth. You want to talk about a growth mindset, is us modeling that and saying, here's where I erred. And you know what? You know what else? I want to hear where you think I erred, because maybe I'm missing some things. Tell me how you felt abandoned by me. And I want to hear about it. And I will validate what your experience was.
Well, I was going to say, how do you figure out where that gap
Mhm.
is, where you went wrong? And I guess the simplest thing is to ask that question.
Yes.
But
Yes.
but sometimes I don't know that they would know necessarily, if
Oh,
it's
they will
something that they're
know.
not aware
Yeah.
of,
Yeah, they'll know. They
they
will.
will.
They will. But we have to become a trusted, safe person for them to really come to the place where they're going to share the biggest betrayal with us. So we warm up to that. We start with just becoming a safe person. And maybe I would start with just apologizing for what we do know or suspect. And then see, like, once we develop that rapport where they're trusting us more, we can say, is there anything I'm missing? Because I wonder if there is. And then they say, well, actually, there's this time. And then we stay a safe person and go, that's hard for me. Maybe it's hard for me to hear, but you're worth it. You're worth me being uncomfortable. And maybe there's a lot of things I want to say to defend myself, but I'm going to prioritize you and your feelings over mine right now. And I'm not going to defend myself. I'm going to listen. I'm going to empathize, which means I'm going to imagine I'm in your shoes as a 6-year-old and hear how that was like for you and feel what it would feel like for you. That's me having empathy.
Mm.
And I'm going to say, oh God, I don't blame you. Actually, I would feel the same way. I'm going to validate you.
Sometimes that is a hard thing when you get blamed for things that you did never mean to do.
But that's the thing. We screw kids up unintentionally. And even if we didn't intend it, it still hurts them. And so we're the adult, we're the parent, we take the hit and we say, you know what? That wasn't intentional, but I now see how much it hurt you and what it did to you. And I'm sorry.
Thank you. I feel like that's great advice. That's lovely. I want to talk, and maybe this is what we're already talking about, but you have this idea of externalizing our feelings into words, that
Yes.
is the best way to not, harbor any of this shame
Yeah.
or hard feelings that make us sick. So how do we do that without alienating the world? Because so often there's a, social propriety that doesn't allow for venting all your
Yeah.
feelings.
That's a great feeling. Yeah. Point. So I want to distinguish. We externalize our feelings into words. We literally externalize or express them out of our bodies. That is powerful. Some people go to what are those called? Places where you destroy everything, like a rage room. You know what? Those don't work. We need to put them into words. However, it doesn't necessitate that we ever communicate those words to the offending person. And that's the good news, because the offending person might be dead. They might be a parent who refuses to validate anything we say. And so we can't ever have that validation from them or receive that. And they might be a boss that we could never say these things to, but we need to externalize them into words. We could do that by writing out what I call a fantasy letter, or and I write fantasy letters and I read them to, like, my best friend who co-hosts my podcast with me, Katie. She validates. We need someone to validate it for us, but usually it's not going to be the person we're writing it to, because that would actually be counterproductive in most cases. And we'd feel worse than if we didn't do anything. So we do validate it for ourselves, and we find someone who will validate it for us.
Okay. And does it have to be read out loud or just writing it is enough word?
Sometimes for me, writing it is enough, but sometimes there's times where I'm like, I need to read this out loud. I need Katie to listen to it and just go, yes and amen.
Okay. So you've said that most types of medications don't work for depression, and even therapies don't work for depression
Yeah.
and anxiety. So I want to
Yeah.
hear about that because there are a lot of people on meds, messing with the serotonin and stuff, and it works for many people. So tell me what you think.
It works as in, it can work as in it manages the symptoms. But if we view anxiety and depression and mental illness as symptoms of a root problem, it's just managing symptoms. And that's what a lot of, unfortunately, therapeutic modalities do. They manage symptoms. So, Lori Lee, if you're really angry and all I'm doing is telling you to breathe more, I mean, that's not a bad thing. Just like taking medications isn't a innately bad thing necessarily. But is it getting to the root of your anger? No, because anger is a relational issue. It's not something that I just feel for no reason. There's always a reason, and it's always relational. And so if you live with a very narcissistic, partner who is verbally abusing you every day, and you're not doing anything about it, you're letting all that anger reside in your body, that's going to create a lot of depression and or anxiety or both. And so if I'm your therapist and all I'm doing is prescribing meds or telling you to breathe and think better thoughts, personally, I find that very gaslighting. So I would go deep and say, okay, well, let's talk about this suppressed anger, this dissociated anger you're having because you're codependent with this narcissist, which is usually a winning combination, what most people do. And I say, let's talk about this anger. So the anger, it's invisible, but it's just as real as this laptop I'm talking to you on right now, if not more. Let's express it, externalize it out of your body into words and actions. And those things are boundaries. Might be a big boundary of like moving out. It might be assertiveness, like saying, hey, I'm not responsible for your feelings. Guess what? You're responsible for your feelings, not me. It might be accountability, and that would be more like with a boss or something like that, right? So those are the three outlets where we channel our anger into action or assertive speech. So I talk about this in my podcast too. The word emotion is evoke motion, emotion. Like our emotions want to move us. And if we refuse to do anything, if we just let them stagnate in our bodies, we will get sick. So that anger, we need to see it not as I shouldn't be angry. Anger is bad and evil. No, we need to see it as it's a light on the gas or the dashboard of our car saying, blink, blink, warning, check under the hood. Something is wrong and is in need of repair. And if we see it like that and we relate to our anger, we heal our relationship with our anger and we start to attune to it and say, ooh, I hear you loud and clear. What's going on? What am I angry at? What do I need to fix? Help me understand. And then we respond with that motion.
So are you saying that anger is the source for all depression and anxiety?
I think anger and shame are the two things that causes depression, anxiety, and they come together often.
None of you don't think any of it is physiological with like not having enough serotonin and stuff like that?
Well, it's all the above, because when you have suppressed anger hanging out in your body and shame, your body will physiologically respond and produce less serotonin. So I don't see these things as like either or, why do we have to choose?
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Huh. Okay. So then what role does shame play in our lives? Are we clumping all these different emotions together, anger and shame?
So shame is not an emotion because it doesn't want to move us forward. All the other emotions or feelings, they want to move us. Shame just wants to make us stuck. It wants to debilitate, and that's exactly what it does. It has no agenda for us to move. It's the opposite. So shame tells us, instead of, hey, I made a mistake, I'm human, it says you are a mistake. And so shame is so powerful, we dissociate from it and we betray ourselves when we do that. We become exiles to ourselves.
Okay, so let's say that we know that that's part of us, or we know that it's part of our children or something. Everybody deals with shame of some sort at some time or another. How do you get rid of that? How do you purge your body of that? Is it just something you talk about? You pinpoint what's
Yeah.
causing the feeling and then you put
Yeah.
it into words?
No. So with shame, I do this on my podcast again. So my co-host, Katie, who is my best friend, I do a lot of my exercises that I do with my clients on her for the listeners to be able to do them for themselves. That's my goal, is people who will never have me as a therapist can do these for themselves by listening. So I do an exercise. It's called a shame exercise in our imagination. And so shame, real quick, is a social construct. So infants are born into the world with all the emotions, but they're not born with shame, which is a feeling, but not an emotion. Shame comes from other humans, especially parents saying, don't be angry, Lori Lee. Anger is shameful. So that little girl learns right off the bat, I can't be angry. I can't show anger. That's shameful, right? And so what I have my clients do is I have them remember a time in their childhood where they were being shamed. It could be either explicitly, or most likely it's not explicit, it's implicit, where maybe their parent just made a face like, ugh, not good, or, something where shame was communicated in some way. Maybe they felt, neglected, like the parent just ignored them, gave them silent treatment, that kind
Could
of
we
thing.
say disapproval as a
Yes,
synonym for shame?
absolutely. So when our parent expresses disapproval, we will feel shame, but you going back to you saying you didn't intend to hurt your kids. Well, how are we supposed to be parents without ever expressing disapproval? Do we intend to shame them? No. Do we really disapprove? Yes, we do. So that's why we all hurt our kids unwittingly. Because there's things we are going to disapprove of. And it's so sensitive here. But so to go back to a time, a memory we have of our parent expressing disapproval of us, where, as a child, we don't differentiate between, oh, they're actually disapproving of my action, not me. We take it as they disapprove of me, thus I am shameful. So we go back to like an imprinting memory, like an early memory of that. And then I just have my client close their eyes, picture that in their head. They see themselves as, 5-year-old Lori Lee, and they picture their adult self entering that memory, going over to 5-year-old Lori Lee, looking her in the eyes, getting down on her level and saying, Lori Lee, what I need you to know is, and I see how ashamed you feel, but what I need you to know is that you're not the shameful one. Actually, that was your dad. It was shameful for your dad to shame you like he did. And he didn't just shame your behavior. He made you feel ashamed, whether he did it intentionally or not. The shame is his. So we're going to put all your shame in a big cardboard box right now, and we're going to hand it back to him. We're going to say, hey, return to owner. Here you go. This is yours. It was never mine. I'm human and I make mistakes, but I am not shameful. So I'm going to give it back to you.
Thank you for sharing that exercise. How do we raise children or help children that are older, like my kids that are older now? What can I do? What I'm picking up from you is maybe what I do is I ask them, hey, are there times where you felt like I was disapproving of you and that stuck with you? And does that have any bearing on the things that you're struggling with now? So is that what we do? Or how do we help children who are already suffering with depression and anxiety?
Yeah, so we can ask them. They might not tell us because they don't feel safe enough to. If they don't feel safe enough, then I'd say, wow, I don't think you trust me. And I want to, if you're open to it, I would like to hear why that is. Because I must have really betrayed your trust. And I'd like to hear what caused that, because I will believe you. I really will. I'm coming to a place where I'm starting to see that I'm not an all good mom. I'm not an all bad mom. I'm just a mom, and I make mistakes. And there's things I have echoed that my parents did that, maybe I shouldn't have. Maybe I need to pivot in these areas. And I'm open and I'm willing to hear, even if it's hard for me. And I want to earn back your trust. So tell me more about why you're not trusting me enough. Or if maybe you don't want to tell me right now, but I want to let you know that if something comes to mind and you do want to share, I am all ears.
Okay, so these are the conversations that we want to try to embark on with children who may be suffering with depression or anxiety, correct?
Yeah. And the more we do our own work, the more we learn about ourselves, we can also lead those conversations. We can say, hey, you know what, son, I'm learning these things about me and they're hard. They're hard to learn. And this is where I'm at, but I'm starting to see things differently. And we can just say that and just put it out there. And maybe nothing will happen. Maybe a week or two later, all of a sudden that son is like, well, can I tell you some things about what you said a week ago? And we're like, yeah, yes, I do want to hear. So I would plant those seeds.
Okay, and then with younger children that we're raising, obviously there's still going to be things that get disapproved of. Children are learning right from wrong and all the things. And so we unintentionally create places of disapproval that may move along with them through their life. But what is the best approach with young children for, I don't know, not creating those spaces?
Oh, it's super easy. So with younger kids, you want to validate their feelings, and which the hardest one to do is anger, as you can imagine. So when they're angry with us, we just go, "Wow, Johnny, you're really angry with me right now. I don't blame you. I bet it's really hard to hear no when you ask for that cookie and you're used to getting it every day at this time. And I don't blame you for being angry. I'd be angry too. It doesn't mean you're going to get the cookie, but you know what? I get that you're angry. I really do. I get it. I don't blame you." So when we can validate our children's feelings, especially their anger at us, because again, that's the hardest one to validate. It's easy to validate their anger at everyone else, but not at us. But when we can do that, it teaches them, I matter. I matter to my mom. It teaches them, I matter because my feelings matter. And that is the most powerful way we can become a safe, trusting parent to them. Does that mean that only their feelings matter from here on out? No. Because when he insists on the cookie, we say, Johnny, my feelings matter too. Your feelings matter and my feelings matter. Everyone's feelings matter. So I'm going to say no to the cookie because I know what's going to happen. But thank you for expressing your feelings. Thank you for being honest with me. I appreciate that.
Oh, this is good stuff. Good stuff. So tell us what your podcast is. You keep referring to your podcast. Let's let the listeners know about it.
Yeah, it's called Angry at the Right Things.
I love it. On all the platforms, I'm assuming.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so any final things that we haven't talked about? We're coming to the end of our time here on the show, but what haven't we talked about that you want to share that you think we need to know?
Yeah, I would like to summarize by saying, I used to think that being true to yourself, I used to equate that with being selfish. And that is no longer the case. Because when we are true to ourselves, when we stop betraying ourselves, that is the least selfish thing we can do because we start to come alive and we start to flourish as humans. And when we flourish as humans, people around us greatly benefit from that. So that is not a selfish act, but we need to learn to stop betraying ourselves. We need to learn to trust ourselves, to listen to ourselves, to our body, our gut, and to attune to ourselves. And that, why be alive if we're not going to really be alive? Life is short.
Great advice. Where do people find you and what do you offer to the listeners, to people in general?
Right now, it's pretty much just my podcast. So I have plenty of clients. I don't need more. But yeah, I want to help other people who are just like me, where they're struggling. They need someone to make sense of things for them. That's what a lot of therapists aren't really good at doing, like to have an overall framework or paradigm that helps them make sense of their lives and their feelings and their mental illnesses. And that is through my podcast. I really want to just get that out to more and more people.
Wonderful. Bronwyn, thank you for being on the show. Thank you for sharing your expertise. And I'm going to try some of the things you've suggested. So we'll have to stay in touch. I'll report back.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Absolutely.
Years ago, like really 20 to 30 years ago, I read this book called Feelings Buried Alive, Never Die. And it became one of my go-to favorites. I still have it and I still refer back to it. But it helped explain so many things to me about life, about myself, about how our feelings would manifest in our physicality. Bronwyn's message is very much the same. If we bury our feelings, they show up in our bodies in different ways. Illnesses and aches, weaknesses, stuff that's just not right. And because our bodies and minds are so closely connected, I believe this is very likely true. I don't think it's the absolute cause for all that ails us. Everything that goes wrong with us physically doesn't stem from a mental situation. But I do believe that it affects us and it affects us deeply. The mental and the physical are deeply intertwined. And as we create our best life stories on purpose, we are always needing to process and grow from the emotions and the messiness that life generates. Understanding how to do this, like the things we've talked about today with Bronwyn, can be crucial to making life changes that bless our lives and our minds and our hearts and our families. So as we close, I want to send my love and best wishes for all of the listeners of the Love Your Story podcast. I hope you got something beautiful from my conversation with Bronwyn today, and I hope that you will take it into your life and use it in a way that blesses you. I am getting ready to take a sabbatical from the Love Your Story podcast, and I want to thank all of the people. We are ending we're coming into the close of our 8th year. So thank you to the listeners, to the supporters, to the people who have learned to love their stories on our 8-year journey together. Thank you for being here. Of course, a show without listeners and people that are being involved really isn't much of a show, is it? So we'll be back in the saddle in no time. But for now, live your best life with intention. And please keep coming back to the Love Your Story library. All of the shows will still be available, especially at loveyourstorypodcast.com. And there are almost 300 incredible episodes at this time with incredible people that have incredible stories that shine a light for the rest of us on how to navigate the tough things. We've talked about so many things over the years, all the big bad stuff, divorce, eating disorders, depression, suicide, rape, all of the really hard things. And physical injuries, the death of children, of spouses. So many people have shared their stories and shown a light on how they made it through those tough things. So 300 episodes of life hacks, things that you could do and it's just such good stuff. I learn from it all the time. I go back and listen to their stories and the tips, and it's always worth it going back through those older shows. So keep using the episodes. Again, it's on loveyourstorypodcast.com. There's so much good out there. Enjoy your lives. Enjoy creating your best lives on purpose, and happy travels on your life adventure until the next episode.